Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. Today I'm using a sketch. This is sketch number 506 from the Freshly Made Sketches blog. I will link that down below. And I will be using some new things, or a new thing. So this is the Honeybee Stamps and Simon Says Stamp exclusive stamp set. It's called Sending Autumn Blessings. This is one of the Stamp Timber specials. When it's gone, it's gone. I don't know if it's still available, but you could do this sketch with any stamp set. Heck, you could not use stamps. I'm also going to use these label dies. I'm going to use the Waffle Flower Circle dies. I have some pieces of patterned paper. This is going to be the background. I'm going to use this orange one here for the stripes in the sketch and this gray one for the circle. I will be stamping on Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 80-pound cardstock. My card base will be gray. And this autumn paper pad from Honeybee is where I got my pattern papers from. I have a palette here of fall colors in my Copic markers that match that background paper. And let's see. At one point, I did use the tip-to-tip technique because there was a huge gap between two of my markers I was trying to close. Also, my markers really need to be refilled, so I really need to spend some time doing that. Some of them are a little less dry than I would like, but it all worked out. I think that's all about the coloring, so let's go ahead and jump into the crime. Now, today, our alphabetical journey takes us to the state of Ohio. Ohio has a rather unusual statehood story that spans 100 years. Most of the time that we read that Ohio was admitted to the Union as the 17th state by Thomas Jefferson in 1803. However, in 1903, while preparing for the 100th birthday of the state, a group of school teachers went to Washington, D.C., to the Library of Congress to look at the documents that made Ohio a state, right? They figured why not have copies of the actual documents as opposed to just pictures of them in textbooks. However, when they got there, they discovered that the document they wanted to obtain a copy of was missing, as in not even recorded in the records of the Library of Congress. Specifically, the legislation that granted the Ohio Territory statehood was apparently never filed. So you see, it appears that the 7th congressional season was the same session that began with the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson as the president. And this is the season that Ohio's statehood was to be determined, or voted upon, I should say. The season ran unusually long, and somehow the final vote for Ohio statehood was overlooked. A few days before, on April 30th, Congress had approved an act to create a state out of the Ohio Territory and ordered the state to draft a constitution and select a government. And Ohio had done that and had actually already submitted the documents, but this long Congress, as it became known, was so much longer than normal that the vote was forgotten about. Enter Ohio Congressman George H. Bender. George was an Ohio representative of the 83rd Congress in 1953 when the Ohio statehood issue again resurfaced. On January 13th, he introduced legislation to grant statehood to Ohio, and on May 9th, the House voted to grant statehood to Ohio, and that statehood was then retroactively enacted to reflect March 1st, 1803. So I guess you could say that one of the most interesting things about Ohio is that there are 2 statehood dates. But did you also know that the small village that became known as Planktown was the home of Ohio's first serial killer? Background first. Okay. In 1837, the village of Richland, or the area of Richland, was first settled by a man named John Long. In the beginning, he was the only settler there, but within a short time, there were about 200 residents in the area. A village grew around there, and they had taverns, stores, and shops to meet the needs of the growing population. Now, another man named John Plank, somehow took on the responsibility of town planner. I don't know how that came to pass. I didn't look it up. But anyway, John Plank determined the layout of the city square and where all of the buildings would be. And he also was owner of the main tavern, probably the biggest or most popular tavern. And eventually, the area of Richland became known as Planktown. Now, this little village thrived until the 1850s when the Cleveland and Columbus Railroad companies built an intersection north of the city of Shelby, which is kind of northwest of Planktown. And it became clear that the money was to be had where the trains would stop, and by 1900, Planktown was all but deserted. And were it not for one man who stayed, it might have been forgotten altogether. So, this gentleman's name was Return Jonathan Meigs Ward, and he was born on June 8, 1815 in Milan, Ohio, and his parents were Jared and Huldah Ward. Return was the youngest of their 5 children. They had two girls and 3 boys. Sadly, Huldah died when Return was only 2 years old, and his father, Jared, never remarried. It was hard for Jared to raise all the children by himself, and eventually Return was sent to their equivalent of what foster care is now. Where he was sent and what that actually looked like, I did not find much documentation of, but I did find a record of a hard life that started young and that turned this boy into a rather disturbed adult man. By the age of 9, or at the age of 9 rather, Return was sent by his father to be a cabin boy on a ship based out of Erie, Pennsylvania, so I'm guessing a fishing ship. At the end of the fishing season, or the shipping season, that vessel was sold, and Return found himself alone in Erie. Eventually, he befriended a group of boys, and together they made their way into Huron and found work on another ship. The captain of this ship was concerned about a boy so young in such a harsh working environment, so he took Return under his wing, and he made it his business to find Return's family. Eventually, Return was reunited with his father. Not for long, though. About as soon as they were together again, Jared once again turned Return out. I should have told that story better. That was bad wording. Sorry. This time, it was toward manual labor. And this career abruptly ended when Return was struck down with a severe case of rheumatism that badly affected his feet. And this time, he was left crippled for life. Now, I could not figure out why Jared sent his youngest son away to work instead of one of the older children. But maybe it was because the rheumatoid, right? Maybe Return's health was just too much for this man, the single father, to deal with or want to deal with. I don't know. Seems like it would make more sense to send one of the older children away. However, the 3 oldest were girls and the 2 youngest were boys. So I don't know. Anyway, once Return was healthy enough to go back to work, he was sent out again, and this time with a brother-in-law, Isaac Collins. Isaac was married to Return's sister, Elizabeth. Isaac had training as a blacksmith, and Return was sent to train under him. The 2 men traveled around their local area and developed a reputation of being a somewhat ragtag kind of a team. They were described as being, quote, a very rough fare, end quote. And to make matters worse, Return was becoming an angry, sullen individual. It was reported that Return had an increasingly short temper and that he became violent when things did not go his way. In 1835, Return changed careers again, and this time was an apprentice to a tailor named Baxter Ashley. This relationship was also short-lived, but for a different reason. It seemed that Baxter was a very religious man, and according to Return, tried to force his religious beliefs onto Return, and that was the breakdown of their work partnership, causing Return to go looking for work somewhere else. And by 1841, he ended up in Mansfield, Ohio. Now, within a couple of years of relocating to Mansfield, Return met Sarah Lamson, and they began courting. Their relationship, however, was not without its own issues, mostly due to Return's behavior. At one point, he was involved with in a fight with a coworker that nearly landed him in jail, but somehow his father was able to intervene and save him from prison. After that, Return burned down a house and was arrested for assault and battery. Now, did Sarah turn and run? No, she did not. She must have liked the bad boy guy because she continued to date Return. Now, Sarah was the daughter of a well-respected local farmer, and when Return finished his jail time, he and Sarah continued their courtship, much to her father's chagrin. When Return actually approached her father asking permission to marry Sarah, her father said no. He did not believe that Return was a good match for Sarah. Did Sarah listen? Did she turn and run away? No, she did not. She did exactly what her parents did not want her to do, and her and Return eloped. Her father, angry and frustrated, disowned Sarah. After their marriage, Return and Sarah moved to Richland County, Ohio, aka Planktown, and Return took over the running of the Eagle House Tavern. One source I read said he had a partner. The other source didn't mention a partner, but whatever. He was running this tavern. It was a bar, a place to get some food, and a place to rent rooms. Okay. He must not have changed his behavior too terribly much because his reputation in town was that of a hothead, and he acted in a way that made people kind of gossip about his behavior or his attitude. At the time that Return was the keeper of the Eagle House Tavern, there was a merchant in town named Noah Hall, and Noah regularly came to the tavern for his dinner. In those days, merchandise sold in the stores wasn't shipped in. The store owner had to go to the city and bring it back. In 1851, Noah was preparing to take his annual trip to New York to purchase things to sell in his shop. And one evening, Return sat in the tavern talking with Noah over dinner, and they talked about his trip east. And they ate their dinner together, and they drank together, and Return locked up after Noah had gone home. What Noah didn't know was that earlier that day, Return had gone into Noah's home and secretly unlocked an external door. After Noah was asleep, Return let himself in and killed Noah by hitting him over the head with an iron poker and smothering him with a pillow. Return claimed to have done it for the money. Noah had saved up $800 for his trip to New York, and that is just over $32,000 in today's money. The odd thing was that no one in town thought Return was the one responsible for killing Noah. When his body was found, Return was not on the list of suspects, which I find interesting because he had already such a horrible reputation. In fact, there were two other men, they were Irishmen, for whatever it's worth, who were suspected and arrested, and then later released due to lack of evidence. But there was one person who thought Return was guilty, and that was Sarah, Return's wife. She, I don't know, she just did not think something didn't sit right with her. In whether she knew that Return had killed Noah, whether she thought Return had killed Noah, or whether she just had bad mental health and then her marriage was not great. This event, the death of Noah, it pushed her past her limits, and she had a nervous breakdown. Her mental state was so bad that she went to live in an asylum in Columbus, and she lived there until she died, and I can't find a year. I can't find a grave, I can't find a year. But she stayed in this asylum in Columbus, Ohio until she died. So things in Planktown settled down, and they were normal for a couple of years. And then about 2 years after Noah's murder, another man went missing. A tin peddler who went by the name of Lovejoy was in town, and he had taken a room at the Eagle House Tavern. Again, Return had sat with a meal and had a drink with the man, and even walked him to his room in the tavern. Return later stated that he had no intention of harming Lovejoy. Like he just walked him to his room and intended to go home. However, later that night, Return let himself into the tavern and up to Lovejoy's room and killed him with one swing of an axe. And he talks about this in one of the sources I have listed below. But basically, it was one hit. Return presumed that the peddler had money on him, and he was correct. But this time, the murder gained him a whopping $50. After killing Lovejoy, Return put his body in a dry goods box and took it to his home and pushed it under his own bed, and then went to sleep for the night. 2 days later, Return thought it was necessary to dispose of the body, so he loaded the box into a wagon, drove 60 miles away, and threw the box off of a bridge into the Huron River. So Return was again never suspected or charged with Lovejoy's murder. And in fact, nobody really knew that a murder had taken place for quite some time, because Return just told them that he checked out of the tavern early and left and headed for parts unknown, because that's what traveling guys did, right? But Return did not stay in Planktown very long after the murder of Lovejoy. He actually moved to Shelby, Ohio. Now, after getting himself settled in Shelby, he met a woman named Susan Rice, and in 1853, they were married. About a year into their marriage, they moved from Shelby to Sylvania, and I did find records of Return and Susan having one daughter, and that daughter died when she was just 2 months old. Now, Return and Susan, there we go. Return and Susan lived in Sylvania for about a year, and then Susan became very ill. Return packed them up and moved Sarah back to her father's farm, where she lived until she died in 1856. Now, I couldn't tell from what I read whether he stayed with her until her death or whether he dropped with her father and went back to Sylvania. Based on the next few events, I think that maybe he left before she passed away, but I'm not sure. So back in Sylvania, Return happened to meet a woman named Olive Rose. Now, Olive is a single mom of 2 children. She had a 9-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl. And Return immediately proposed. Like within a day or 2 or 3 days of knowing each other, they were married. Olive hoped that Return would be a good provider for her and her children. Did I skip the part where Return and Sarah got divorced, the first wife? Or the part where Return and Susan got divorced? No, I didn't, because they weren't. He was still married to Sarah in the asylum when he married Susan. And I believe, based on the timeline, that Susan was still alive when he married Olive. Yeah. So he's just special all the way around. Now, Return turned out not to be the great provider that Olive had hoped for. And in fact, they were dirt floor poor. Return didn't handle the stress of taking care of 2 children. Well, that was a hard sentence. Sorry. Words are hard. Anyway, the economic stress soon to create a division within the couple. They began to argue, and those small arguments turned into big arguments. And one day, Olive said she was done. She was leaving. She packed up the kids and she left. Now, somehow, Return convinced Olive to come home to him. But when she returned without the children and told him that she was only there for the rest of their belongings, Return lost whatever was left of his marbles. The timeline is a little bit sketchy, and one of the sources listed below does have this story from Return's point of view. It seems he was interviewed for an article or something. But on a Tuesday, Return went into town and told the shopkeeper that he and Olive were going to take the children and go away for a while. He asked the shopkeeper to tell anybody who came looking for him that they were leaving. And he implied that they weren't really coming back. So 2 days later, on Thursday, Return went again to the shop and told the shopkeeper that actually Olive had just left him. And when the shopkeeper asked when she left, Return said Tuesday. So what happened between Tuesday and Thursday is a bit, well, it's gruesome. So according to Return, he said that the two argued and Olive had hit him in the head with an oil lamp and also hit him and gave him a bloody nose. And that they each went to bed. And the next day they talked, air quotes here that you can't see, about how she had hit him and made him bleed a lot. And she basically told him he deserved it, and she bent over a stick and with the intent to hit him again. Now, according to him, he wasn't just going to take it this time around, and when she swung at him with the stick, he blocked it. He blocked the hit, knocking the stick from her hand. When she went over to pick it up again, he said he hit her on the head with a clothing iron. He said that she fell to the floor, and within about half an hour, she was dead. The only thing she said after he hit her was to call out her daughter's name. And then he dismembered her with a pocket knife. You see, not too long before Return and Olive had their fatal fight, a local newspaper had printed a rather detailed account of the murder and dismemberment of a Mrs. Ann King. Now, Return had read all about it. Sorry, my dog is a little bit hyper right now. Somebody walked by. She had to say hello. Anyways, Return had read all about this murder of this other woman in the paper. And the paper was way too detailed about how this dismemberment had occurred. So Return followed basically the directions. After he dismembered his wife, he then put her remains in the fire and burned them. And then he gathered together all of the belongings of Olive and her children that she had left behind and burned them also a little at a time as not to make too much smoke. He did not want people to come, thinking the house is on fire or something and see what he was doing. As he burned things, he would collect the ashes and then go to his father's farm and spread them in various fields about his father's farm. Like I said, he lost what was left of his marbles. People in town were struggling with the idea that Olive had come back to town and then left again, without Return being all angry and nasty about it all over town. They believed that she left him. They were struggling with how calmly he was behaving about it. And by the middle of February of 1857, it became clear that Olive hadn't been seen since the end of January. And because people talk, eventually that talk becomes suspicion, and the police were sent to the farm to investigate. You want to guess what they found when they went investigating? Bones. They found in the fireplace bones that hadn't been burned all the way, including Olive's lower jaw. Now, at first, Return claimed that Olive had slipped on the wet floor and hit her head and died immediately without ever speaking another word. No one believed him because if it was an accident, why did he burn her? And for a while, Return told a variation of this story every time he was questioned. Keep in mind that still to this point, he has never been the suspect in any murder other than Olive's, right? So to everybody in town, this is the first red flag that's flying other than his bad temper. So he's got this reputation of being bad-tempered, but really, this is the first red flag. His wife is now missing, right? So eventually, after quite some time of questioning, Return did confess to Olive's murder. He said it was an impromptu act of jealousy and told the police how it happened. How he had hit her and dismantled her or dismembered her, and then spread her ashes. A grand jury was convened, and they determined that there was, in fact, enough evidence to move forward with a trial. Return did stand trial, and according to his own statement, he told his defense attorneys everything, all the same details that he had told the police during the investigation. And not surprising, there was no real good defense for him. There was no way to argue that Return wasn't responsible for his wife's death because he had admitted to it both to his own lawyers and to the prosecution. So the trial began on March 16th of 1857, and on the 27th, the verdict was returned, and Return was convicted of murder in the first degree. He was guilty. Now, of course, there was an appeal because it was a death penalty case, and in these days, the death penalty carried a swift and certain judgment. And while Return waited for this appellate decision, he shocked authorities and the townspeople alike. Return confessed to the murder of Noah and Lovejoy. He told the police how he had snuck into Noah's home and killed him and avoided arrest when the local authorities caught the two other men and thought they were the killers. He told them how he hadn't planned to kill Lovejoy, but the idea of having money was too strong a temptation to overcome. Keep in mind, Lovejoy had $50 on him. These confessions led to people to wonder if he was also responsible for the illness that eventually claimed his second wife, Susan. Did he poison her? Did he kill her? Appeal was denied. Return was given a date for his death. None of his family members came to his trial, and none said they would attend his hanging. It was decided that his hanging would not be a public event like hangings in the past had been. However, still over 100 people ended up in attendance, and not just the police and legal authorities that had been requested or required to be there. On June 12th of 1857, Return Ward was taken to the hangman's gallows. He showed up very contrite and suddenly very religious. He was dressed in all white robes, and he was he was just being this very religious man, which contrary to his previous behavior. He then claimed, as he is walking toward the hangman's noose, that the confessions had been fabricated by a man named Mr. Fuller. And he yelled out into the crowd and demanded that Mr. Fuller show himself. This crowd of people who wasn't actually supposed to be there, right? Surprising no one, there was no Mr. Fuller in the crowd who responded to the statement or the accusation of having fabricated Return's confessions. Return did spend some time making some other statements, most of which, according to the public record, were not really understandable, and they were just kind of gibberish, although he did have one final sentence. Quote, "You might all shut your eyes when I go down, don't laugh." Now, I'm not sure if that was a comment on his stature because he was a larger than average man. He was both tall and broad. Or if that was a comment on his innocence. Don't laugh at me when you hang an innocent man kind of thing. Return did have a lot to say about his life. And there is one, like I said, a source down below where it tells the story in his own words if you want to read them. I'm not sure. I didn't pay attention to, I didn't write down in my notes who he was talking to when he gave his own version of events. Odd side note here, after Return's arrest, while he was waiting to hear from the appellate court, a group of phrenologists, I think I'm saying that right? Phrenologists are people who study the contours of the skull, and they try to determine how the contours of the skull are connected to mental health. I guess there's a whole study on how your head is shaped and how it relates to the way you behave. Anyway, there was this group of phrenologists that wanted to study his skull. They were kind of convinced that his brain held the key to understanding how the shape of the brain was connected to mental health diseases. Specifically, they wanted to study him because of his ability to lie easily, because they claimed this showed a lack of conscience. I find that an interesting group of people who might want to study another individual, but I don't know all about the science in that, so we'll just leave that right there. I found the story of Return interesting because had he not confessed to the murders of Noah and Lovejoy, odds are nobody ever would have classified him as a serial killer. Like, his victims had nothing in common other than they served a selfish purpose for him, right? I don't know. So I just thought it was an interesting story. I did find a picture of Return. I could not find a picture of any of the three of his wives. So that's kind of unusual, I suppose. Or maybe not for the time. I don't know. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed the story. I have a couple of other videos here I think you would like as well. I've also added a subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below. Tell me what you think about this story. Give me a thumbs up if you like the video, and have a really fabulous day.